The video was 11 seconds long. That was all it took. 11 seconds of a small monkey sitting alone in the corner of a stone enclosure, holding a stuffed animal against his chest, while 60 other monkeys went about their day like he wasn't even there. No dramatic music. No slow motion. Just 11 seconds of something so quiet and so heavy that people couldn't look away. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed 19 million times. And within 48 hours, people were furious. The comments were exactly what you'd expect when the internet decides something is wrong. Cruel. Heartbreaking. Why isn't anyone doing anything? Someone needs to step in. This is abuse. This is neglect. This is exactly why animals shouldn't be kept in zoos at all. The video got picked up by news outlets in 7 countries. Animal rights organizations issued statements. A petition demanding intervention cleared 100,000 signatures before the end of the week. The zoo's phone lines were overwhelmed. The director issued a statement. The keepers stopped checking their personal social media. And in the middle of all of it, a young monkey named Chip sat in his corner on Monkey Mountain, held his stuffed animal, and had absolutely no idea that 19 million people were watching him. Here's what those 19 million people didn't know. They didn't know about the 5 months that came before that video. They didn't know about the 2 keepers who had been arriving before their shifts started and staying after their shifts ended, every single day, without being asked, for those 5 months. They didn't know about the glass wall Chip had spent 3 weeks pressing his face against, watching 60 animals he couldn't yet reach. They didn't know that the stuffed animal in his arms had been the one thing standing between a 500-gram newborn and complete psychological collapse on the very first night of his life. They saw 11 seconds. The story was 8 months long. And the part that nobody filmed, the part that happened in the quiet spaces between the dramatic moments, the part that actually explains everything you see in that 11-second clip, that's the part worth knowing. Chip was born on a Wednesday morning in early August, the first infant of a young first-time mother who had no idea what to do with him. She was not cruel. She was not broken. She was a 6-year-old macaque who had never watched another mother raise an infant, who had never had the chance to learn by observation the way macaque mothers normally do. And when the moment arrived and the instinct that was supposed to come with it didn't, she had nothing to draw from. She looked at her newborn once, then she moved away. The keeper who pulled Chip from the enclosure that morning was a 26-year-old named Marcus. 2 years at this zoo. Not the senior keeper on duty. Not the one the facility would have chosen for this if there had been time to make deliberate choices. But he was the one who was there. And he was the one who picked up the infant, wrapped him in his jacket, and carried him to the keeper station. And somewhere in those first 20 minutes of frantic decision-making, this became his responsibility. His colleague Pete arrived 11 minutes after the radio call. 32 years old, 3 years more experience, a 4-year-old daughter at home, and a particular way of approaching difficult situations that Marcus had come to rely on. Pete looked at the infant in the incubator, looked at Marcus, and said they would figure it out together. They did 2 bottles a day at first, then 4, then every 4 hours around the clock for the first week, splitting the overnight shifts in a rotation that neither of them formally agreed to, but both of them simply kept showing up for. The veterinary team handled the clinical side. Marcus and Pete handled everything else. On the second night, Marcus went through every soft object in the supply room trying to find something Chip would hold on to. A rolled towel, a stuffed penguin, a folded fleece blanket, a cloth ball, a giraffe that had been sitting on the back shelf long enough to collect dust. The infant gripped things briefly and released them. one after another, and his stress vocalizations had been continuous for most of the previous 30 hours. And the veterinary team had told Marcus, carefully and professionally, that prolonged stress in a neonate this size had consequences that were not reversible. He was on his knees in front of the lowest shelf when he found it. A stuffed orangutan. Large, rust-colored, long arms with Velcro at the wrists. Nobody remembered who had left it there or how long ago. Marcus set it on the floor in front of the infant without any particular expectation. The infant walked toward it, pressed his face into its chest, went quiet. Marcus sat on the floor of that supply room for a long time after that. What followed over the next 5 months was the kind of work that does not make for dramatic footage. It was quiet, repetitive, and relentless in the way that caring for something small and vulnerable is always relentless. Marcus warmed bottles between his palms rather than under hot water because he had read that animals can detect the difference between heat from a machine and heat from a living body. And even if that wasn't fully proven, it felt important enough to act on. Pete kept a logbook of weight readings and behavioral observations in handwriting so precise that the veterinary team once asked him if he'd trained as a nurse. They built routines that Chip came to depend on. Specific sequences of sound and movement that told him, before anything else happened, that he was safe. They noticed the things the official log had no category for. The first time Chip voluntarily released the stuffed orangutan to reach for Marcus's hand, the way his grip tightened in the seconds before, something startled him, as if some part of him knew what was coming before he did. The morning, Pete discovered that singing quietly while prepping the formula made Chip sit completely still on the counter and watch him with an expression that looked, if you were willing to say it out loud, like contentment. Chip grew. He learned to climb. He learned that Marcus's right shoulder was the best vantage point in any room and that Pete's lunch was always worth investigating. He carried the stuffed orangutan everywhere, riding on its back the way he would have ridden on his mother, face turned outward, watching everything. He was thriving. And that made what came next harder, not easier. The transition to Monkey Mountain was always the plan. It was always the entire point. Every bottle warmed between 2 palms, and every overnight shift covered without complaint was in service of one goal: getting Chip to a place where he could enter the main enclosure and build a real life among his own kind. Marcus understood this with complete clarity from the beginning. That did not make the acclimation period any easier to watch. Chip was moved to the adjacent enclosure in the 3rd month, close enough to hear and smell the 60 animals on the other side of the glass. And every single day, for 3 weeks, he pressed his face against that glass and watched them. Not the way a curious animal watches something unfamiliar, the way a student watches something they are desperate to understand. He tracked the movements of individual animals across the mountain for hours at a time. He watched the social arrangements shift and reform. He watched the corrections and the reconciliations, the small gestures of dominance and deference that happened so fast you could miss them if you blinked. Marcus stood outside the adjacent enclosure one afternoon in the 2nd week and watched Chip watch a mid-ranked female groom a juvenile on the upper ledge. Chip's eyes did not move from them for 11 minutes. His hands were still. The stuffed orangutan was tucked under one arm. Forgotten. Marcus had spent months learning to read this animal. He knew the difference between the stillness that meant Chip was settled and the stillness that meant something else. This was something else. This was the stillness of an animal that understood, on some level, that something was happening on the other side of that glass that he did not yet have access to, and that he needed to. There was an evening in the 3rd week when Marcus arrived for the evening check and found Chip sitting in the far corner of the adjacent enclosure with his back to the glass. Not watching the colony, facing away from it. The stuffed orangutan was pressed against his chest with both hands, and he was very still. Marcus stood outside the fence for a long time. He did not go in. He did not write anything in the notebook that evening. The gate opened 8 days later. Chip stood at the threshold for 8 seconds. Then he walked through with the stuffed orangutan held against his chest, and Marcus stood 8 meters back and watched him enter a world that had 60 residents who did not know him and no particular reason to care whether he stayed or went. The first 2 weeks were a series of corrections. Chip did not know the rules. He misread postures, misjudged distances, approached animals without the social vocabulary to do it correctly, and was redirected each time in ways that ranged from a warning glance to a sharp physical reminder. He was not sustained targets of aggression. He was simply treated the way any community treats someone who doesn't yet speak the language. With impatience, with indifference, and with the occasional firm clarification of where the lines were. Every time he was pushed to the edge of the group, he waited, and then he moved back toward the center. Marcus wrote in the keeper log each evening without interpretation. Subject returned to main enclosure area after each incident. He wrote it the same way every time. He read it differently every time. And then the video happened. A visitor filmed it on day 23, 41 seconds of Chip sitting alone in the far corner of the enclosure, holding the stuffed orangutan, while the troop moved through their morning routines around him. Nothing unusual had just happened. No dramatic incident preceded it. Chip sat in his corner the way he sat there every morning during the slow and non-linear process of figuring out where he fit. But 41 seconds of a small monkey alone with a stuffed animal, surrounded by 60 animals who weren't paying attention to him, looked like something very specific to the people who watched it without context. It looked like abandonment. 19 million views. Outrage in 7 countries. 100,000 signatures on a petition. Animal rights organizations calling for immediate intervention. The zoo's phone lines overwhelmed before noon. Marcus read the director's statement in the parking lot before his shift. It was accurate. It addressed the biology of macaque social integration with precision and patience. It explained why the corrections Chip had experienced were normal troop behavior and not sustained aggression. It noted that Chip was eating, sleeping, and gaining weight on schedule. Every word of it was true, and then Marcus walked inside, checked on Chip through the observation window, and saw something that the director's statement had not addressed and could not have addressed, because it had nothing to do with biology. Chip was in his corner. He was holding the stuffed orangutan with both hands, face pressed into its chest, in the grip that Marcus recognized from the very first night. The grip that meant something had frightened him. Not the loose, habitual carry of the past few weeks, the original grip. The one from before everything. The zoo had been inundated with calls all morning. Journalists were waiting at the front gate. The director was in back-to-back meetings. And Chip, who had no idea that 19 million people were watching him and arguing about his welfare, had retreated to the one thing that had never required him to be anything other than what he was. Marcus stood at the observation window for a while. Then Pete appeared beside him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Pete said that Chip had been in the corner since early morning. Marcus nodded. Pete asked if he thought the attention was affecting the troop's behavior, whether the increased visitor traffic and the noise outside was creating pressure that was filtering into the enclosure. Marcus said probably. They stood there together at the window. Outside, the zoo was louder than usual. Inside the enclosure, 60 animals were going about their morning with the complete indifference of creatures who did not read the news. What Marcus did not say out loud, but what Pete understood anyway, was that there was nothing either of them could do about the 19 million people. There was nothing they could do about the petition or the news outlets or the animal rights organizations or the director's phone calls. The only thing they could do was exactly what they had been doing for 5 months. Show up. Watch. Wait. That evening, Marcus stayed 2 hours past the end of his shift. He sat on the low bench outside the observation area and watched the mountains settle into its end-of-day arrangements. Chip was in his corner. The stuffed orangutan was against his chest. The troop moved around him in the indifferent, ordinary way of animals who had more pressing things to attend to than a young macaque they didn't know yet. Marcus watched until it got dark. Then he went home. The petition reached 200,000 signatures that night. What happened 11 days later was not filmed. There was no visitor with a phone at the right angle. There was no camera crew. There were only the keepers doing their morning rounds, and the mountain doing what it always did, and one unremarkable mid-ranked female, named nothing notable in the troop's hierarchy, walking across the enclosure with no visible purpose. She walked to where Chip was sitting in his corner. She sat down beside him. She looked out at the middle distance for a moment, the way animals do when they are deciding something without appearing to decide it, and then she reached over and began grooming the back of his neck. Her hands moved from the base of his skull downward in the slow, deliberate rhythm of an animal that has done this 10,000 times. Chip sat without moving. He held the stuffed orangutan in his lap. He did not pull away. In macaque society, grooming is not hygiene. It is the primary language of recognition. It is the gesture that says, I have noticed you are here, and I am choosing, out of everything available to me this morning, to put my hands on you. Chip had been on that mountain for 32 days without anyone making that gesture. He sat very still while it happened. Marcus was outside the fence. Pete was at the observation post. Neither of them moved. 7 minutes passed. The female's hands worked in the unhurried way of something with no particular agenda other than the one directly in front of it. Chip sat and received it. His eyes moved once to the stuffed orangutan in his lap. Then he looked at the far wall. When the female stood and walked back toward the main body of the troop, Chip watched her go. He did not follow, but he stayed looking in the direction she had gone for a long time before he turned back to his corner. Marcus uncrossed his arms. He had spent 5 months getting up before dawn, warming bottles between his palms, sitting on concrete floors, writing in a notebook about things that had no official category. He had stood outside a glass wall watching a small monkey study 60 animals he couldn't yet reach. He had read a director's statement in a parking lot and walked inside and found the animal he had raised from 500 grams pressed against a stuffed orangutan with both hands because the world outside had gotten too loud. He had done all of it knowing this was the goal. Knowing the bridge was always meant to be temporary. Knowing that success looked like being needed less and less until one day the animal you had raised found something the stuffed animal could never give him. Something that had a heartbeat. Something that had a choice. Something that could decide on its own to walk across a stone enclosure on a Tuesday morning and put its hands on him and say in the only language available, I see you. 32 days. That was how long it took. Pete came down from the observation post and stood beside Marcus at the fence. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Pete said that Chip had not moved from that spot in 20 minutes. Marcus looked. Chip was still sitting where the female had left him, the stuffed orangutan loose in his lap, eyes on the direction she had gone. He said, yeah. That was all either of them said. The video from day 23 is still online. It still gets shared periodically, usually without context, usually with a caption about loneliness or cruelty, or the conditions of captive animals. The comments still fill up with the same certainty that what they are seeing is the complete story. 11 seconds. 19 million views. The story was 8 months long. 3 months after the video, Chip was sleeping in the main cluster on the upper south ledge every night. Not at the edge, somewhere in the middle. Pressed between animals who had no memory of the morning, he walked through the gate with a stuffed orangutan held against his chest and 8 seconds of hesitation before he decided to try. The stuffed animal was still there. He still carried it, loosely. The way you keep something close, not because you need it the way you once did, but because it was there before anything else was. Marcus watched him from outside the fence one evening when the light was going flat across the mountain and the troop was settling into its end-of-day arrangements. He watched Chip move through the group with the easy, unhurried confidence of an animal that knew where he fit. He took out his notebook. He did not write anything. He just held it for a while, watching the mountain go quiet in the last of the light. Then he put it back in his pocket and went to finish his rounds.